AI is certainly not a monolithic thing. It has so many different dimensions, so many different applications of utilization, and you can't just claiming the fact that you're using AI is not a victory. There are a million different ways to utilize AI, many of which are not actually impactful to moving the company forward.
Welcome to the Chief AI Officer or CAIO podcast, where AI mentor Sanjay Puri talks with the leaders shaping tomorrow's technology. We explore their stories, challenges, and big ideas driving change. So if you're curious about how AI is transforming work, business, and everyday life, this is your front row seat to the future. Josh Fecteau is the Chief Data and AI Officer at Teradata, where he leads the company's AI and data strategy during one of the most transformative moments in enterprise technology. With over 20 years of experience, he's helped position Teradata as its own customer zero, proving how trusted data and AI can deliver real business impact.
Josh, welcome to the CIO podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sanjay, and appreciate the intro.
So briefly, if you can just explain what Teradata is, and secondly, what does a chief data and AI officer do? I think that would be helpful for our listeners.
Teradata was one of the early pioneers of data warehousing and big data along the way, right? So bringing massive amounts of data from across organizations together so that it can be used, and that was where kind of the data warehousing concept was born out of. But over the years, Teradata has evolved and adapted and become more than that. But it's known for its massive parallel processing, its immense power in being able to move large amounts of data at scale across enterprises and make it consumable. So that's been kind of the remit or the framing of Teradata for a long time, used by many of the biggest companies around the globe. It was originally born as an on-prem solution prior to cloud even existing, right? And then with the advancement of cloud and the adoption of cloud, Teradata technologies also became available in the cloud. So it's a hybrid architecture. And now, naturally, in more recent times, in the last few years, Teradata has really invested in becoming the autonomous AI and knowledge platform for enterprises. So it's a pivot from becoming just an enterprise data warehousing platform to becoming an autonomous AI and knowledge platform for a company, which is something we'll probably get a little bit more into, Sanjay, in our discussions.
You are now the CDAO, and most people think of the chief AI officer path or CDAO path as coming from data science or machine learning. But your path came really through architecture and business transformation, Josh. How did the non-traditional route actually prepare you better for this role than a purely technical, let's say, ML background might have?
And I actually went to school for a combination of business and technology. The relationship between those two is so important. And the higher up you move within a company, understanding how the business operates, understanding what moves the needle from a business and strategy perspective, is kind of something that you anchor to when you're making technological decisions and recommendations, right? So, but also the architecture component that you mentioned, Sanjay. So I ran the enterprise architecture function at Teradata for a number of years. And to me, that's a huge help, not just owning the enterprise architecture, but the data components, because how you do things with AI is very important, right? So the how is a very important component of making AI scale and stick and have an impact on your company, because it's so readily available and so easy to utilize in different ways that it's tempting to just chase different use cases in isolation or chase the shiny ball. Having architectural discipline and creating foundations that actually scale is really important. So yeah, having a balance between business and technology is important. And frankly, boards of directors and ELT members may not necessarily understand the data science aspects of being a chief data or AI officer, right? We need to speak in business terms. So it's very important to bring those two things together, I think.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Since you brought up the important topic of boards and you said the how is very important, when you measure ROI internally at Teradata for AI, which is a very hot topic, as you know. And the board asks you to justify the investment, let's say in agentic AI for capabilities. Are there certain metrics, and this is a question really from one of your peers, are there certain metrics that you're putting in front of the board and saying, hey, and are there specific ones you think the board cares about more? Because your peers have to go in front of the boards and they're trying to figure out how to do it. So this is a question from one of your peers.
There's the individual utilization of AI, the upskilling of your workforce, the transformation of human beings as human beings that utilize AI. That's a bucket. And I'm bucketizing, I'm putting them in buckets for simplification, right? The second is enterprise, how you deploy agentic capabilities across your enterprise, how you facilitate enterprise decision making and autonomy at scale across your company. You have to do both of those things. The first one is difficult to quantify because individual productivity is difficult to quantify, always has been. If you take product engineering or development, for example, you have certain things that you can measure, certain outputs that you can measure in terms of productivity. Within finance or marketing, where functions are more creative, it's a little bit more difficult to measure productivity. So the way I frame that first part with the board and with other leadership team is this is non-discretionary. This is a time we've not seen in, and I'm not being alarmist, this is a time we've not seen in a very long time, maybe since the dawn of the computer, but it's person plus AI. And if it's not person plus AI, then you're not going to be competitive with the rest of the world, right? And in order for us to get ahead, we have to treat that as a non-discretionary thing. So while it may be difficult to measure, we'll find ways, but you have to assume, you have to start with the fact that everybody needs it. You have to make it available to everybody. Otherwise, you're doing your employees a disservice. But the second component, and that's, probably a conversation we can delve more into, but the second component is the business aspect, right? So how do we implement agentic AI across the company? How do we implement autonomous systems and or even semi-autonomous systems that have human intervention to actually transform our business? Now, I think it's important. I think about it in terms of Gartner has a metrics pyramid where you start with kind of your company's business objectives, and then you have your strategic imperatives, and then you have your more operational things at the bottom, right? Nothing has changed from the perspective of you still should be able to pull a thread from your company's business objectives all the way through your operational metrics that you're measuring for individual capabilities. So it's very important, and this is hard, but it's very important to anchor your AI initiatives back to the company's strategic objectives, imperatives, business objectives, and the strategic things you're measuring, whether it's, your company's ARR, whether it's, any financial metric, your top line, your bottom line growth. And you want to put markers out there to say, here's where we expect to get to. But you want to develop proof points early on that help establish a credible ROI that you can stand behind before you fully operationalize that thing. And if you can't do that, you should probably abandon it.
And is this a honeymoon period that you get a long leash and say, fine, we'll keep investing because it's going to come, everybody else is doing it? And how long will that last? What do you think?
I think last year may have been the honeymoon period, Sanjay. It feels like the leash is tightening. Again, this is not specific to Teradata, but I think expectations are growing in terms of we know these large language models are growing almost exponentially in capabilities, right? They're the power that's coming from one generation of an LLM to the next is almost scary. But we're unable to attach that, we're still unable to attach that to a company, moving a company forward in a way that is anywhere near as significant as the pace that the LLMs are moving, right? So I think there's growing frustration amongst, shareholders. Like, I'm expecting to see more of a transformation. I'm expecting more, and more. We let you invest in some AI. Now I want to see, you better be able to quantify the returns. And that's difficult because ROI is a lagging indicator in the first place, right? That ROI may be something that manifests over a period of 6, 9 months, or even a year, especially if you're a company that does large transactions over long periods of time, right? It's it's a lagging indicator, but you need to be able to show early signs that this is going to deliver what you say it's going to deliver. Some companies are coming right out and saying, we've rolled out 40,000 AI agents and we basically laid off X number of people. Other companies are saying we're not using AI as a means of replacing people. And honestly, that balance is in my position, right? In any position at the top of a company, that's a tough. The messaging alone is tough, right? Because the intention is not to replace people with AI, but people are operating cost for a company, right? Operating cost for the company is a financial measurement. So we're always looking for ways to optimize our operating costs. Sometimes that results in people, but AI is no different than any other cost optimization strategy. Ideally, we're finding ways to have people utilize the AI to become more productive and find other ways, business processes, other systems to retire, other ways to reduce your operating costs. And if we don't, everybody's going to be scared, right? And when everybody's afraid of being replaced by a thing, they're more reluctant to embrace that thing.
Josh, I'm going to switch topics, take you back a few years if possible. You were at CIO Sensei and you were advising chief information officers, I think, on enterprise transformation, etc. There, you probably got a chance to see what some CIOs were trying to do with emerging technologies. Whatever technologies that when you were at Sensei that you were advising, and now when you look at this, are there parallels to any of that?
AI is it's actually a much more difficult time because even us folks like yourself and myself and your listeners, Sanjay, we're close to this stuff, but we still can't see into the future right now, and that's a weird place to be. Like usually, we have some idea of what's going to happen a year from now. The ground underneath us is changing every 6 months. If you and I and the other chief data officers, chief AI officers aren't recalibrating our strategy every 6 months, it's going to be obsolete. Which I don't remember a time that's been the case. So that's probably the closest parallel. It's that wrestling with how 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 do I make sure that I'm not falling behind the rest of the world, but I don't over rotate and get us into a position that we can't actually support it. And I think the other thing I'll just add to that is AI is it's certainly not a monolithic thing, right? It has so many different dimensions, so many different applications of utilization, and you can't just claiming the fact that you're using AI is not a victory. There are a million different ways to utilize AI, many of which are not actually impactful to moving the company forward. And I definitely worry about the state of companies 2 years from now that attacked AI in the wrong way and suddenly have no sources of truth for decision making within their company.
The speed and scale of change with AI is way, way different than what you had. And you don't want to be left behind, but you don't want to go full tilt. So, for your peers who are listening in, especially with the vast experience you bring, are there any pointers for them how to balance, or are you also trying to still figure this out?
Be open to the fact that the technology is shifting very fast. The technology is being commoditized. Um, so your ideas and how you wield that technology become your differentiator, your competitive differentiator. A scalable foundational architecture, I think, is important, even if even if the technologies around that architecture are shifting. You need to have some foundational knowledge, foundational company data to anchor back to. Otherwise, you won't be able to apply the fast moving technologies in a way that actually moves the needle for your company. So refresh your strategy often. It drives my team crazy, believe me, if I say, hey, we need to rethink this strategy, but you have to be realistic. Even if that means having tough conversations with the board and say, yes, I know I said this 6 months ago, but X, Y, and Z have changed, right? The new Opus 4.6 model is significantly different, right, than Sonnet or Haiku were a year ago. And the way it can develop code, the way people can develop code and build applications, you can't compare that to what someone was trying to do with GitHub Copilot using Haiku a year ago. You just can't. It's not even remotely apples to apples, right? So we have to be open to that understanding. Like, whoa, we need to really shift the way we're thinking about development productivity here.
Walk us through some internal AI deployment that directly shaped a product or service offering for our listeners a little bit.
The way I think about customer zero, it's a forcing function for honesty. And that's difficult. It's a difficult position. I have to still be friends with our chief product officer and get stuff done. But we have to, my team, my organization is the biggest critic. We don't want to let anything touch our customers unless we feel it's good enough for us to use, period. So we set that high bar, and product engineering knows that. And I think it inspires them to even more optimization and perfection with the product. And we know technology is technology; it's never going to be actually perfect. But we're going to find things before our customers do, and more importantly, we're going to provide feedback on real world applicability, which is really important with AI, especially because it's so novel. Some of the agentic capabilities we're rolling out are so novel. It's hard to gain credibility in the marketplace in unless you have some proof points, right? And we can point to something and say it is credible. And so I can go up there and say, and I won't do this, I promise, I will never stand on stage or anywhere else and say this thing works if I haven't validated that it works. But not only do I want to say it works, I want to say it works, and here's how. We actually applied our vector store. We vectorized all of the contracts and unstructured documents that we have across the company. We turn that into an agentic workflow for account planning. And that's an example you're seeing in real time, our agent builder, our vector store being used. And I can even tell you that the FTE hours that we saved off of it, right? So it's not always going to be that straightforward, but that is 100% my goal. Any new feature and function, it's going to come to my team and we're going to run through it. And that doesn't mean, it's also important to note, right? Teradata never exists in isolation. It exists as part of a broader ecosystem. But I do believe strongly in the concept, and I think we've proven this out, that the hub and spoke model for knowledge and enterprise truth is very effective with AI, especially for reusability. And we've kind of demonstrated that J curve of make an initial investment, and then you start to see the compounding returns because you're reusing truths and you're reusing outputs of LLMs that have already been governed. Whereas if you have disparate implementations across systems, it's very difficult to navigate.
You recently showcased AI-powered account planning automation that has reportedly cut sales prep time in half. When you were displaying it to your sales team, what was their reaction and how did you deal with it? This is more about, your peers have change management, and how do you deal with those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think two different dimensions to think about. And if I go back to the metrics and how we measure our success, attribution of, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but attribution is a difficult concept with AI initiatives. It's difficult to say how much of this solution can be attributed to AI, especially when you have groups like in sales that have compensation structures that are based on, what they're delivering, right? We're going to be in this weird position, and this is a kind of a warning, a friendly warning to our audience here, that we're going to have people competing against agents for credit. And I'm not saying that happened at my company at all. In fact, it didn't. But I'm fully prepared for that scenario where we're going to have, especially because the earlier conversation we had, people don't want to be replaced by AI. So they don't want to give the perception that AI solved this problem and I can attribute this ROI to the AI and not the people that are working. And sometimes it's both, but sometimes it's autonomous and it actually is the AI. So that attribution is something we're all trying to figure out. We brought in, and huge credit to our chief revenue officer, but the initiative was spearheaded by sales, by the go-to-market organization, and you need that stakeholder buy-in just to navigate company dynamics, right? If you have that stakeholder buy-in where they say, this is a need, this is going to make a big difference, then they'll make the resources available because you're freeing up X number of capacity for them. And we brought humans in the loop for constant feedback and optimization and prompt building and MCP tooling, and they made it better, right? They made it better in partnership with the technology team. They figured out this is the most important data. No, you need to go gather Zoom info data or get a company's 10K, or you need to look at a competitive intelligence, right? And bring that into the mix. Bring them to the table, make sure they're bought in and leading from the front. And I promise you'll be more successful. And I know that's easier said than done.
Since you brought up the topic of agents, let's talk about agents and some of the questions that came in also for you from that. You have said that making real knowledge available to agents is how you win the race to agentic. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So the thing that I think is most important, Sanjay, for companies, especially, is having your AI, your artificial intelligence needs to anchor back to truths within your company. Truths truths within a company are a combination of data, semantic understanding, and knowledge that are in people's heads. That's how we make decisions, right? And then if your company, if you can't make decisions based on the AI, then it's not really useful. The whole point, and the reason there's such a disconnect or disparity between individual use and use outside of companies and the application within a company is because you have to anchor back to your company's truths in order to make real decisions. Your company's financials, who are your customers, right? And it's not good enough to just look in a database field because you'll probably see a database field has 27 different fields that look a lot like a customer, right? But there's additional layers of semantics on top of that and business knowledge that comes to governing. Okay, we've all agreed this is our master customer. Now our master customer is applied this way in go to market, it's applied this way in customer services. If you don't anchor your AI decisions back to those fundamentals, it'll be wrong. It's just going to be wrong, right? And your hallucinations are going to amplify it. And then the information that comes out of the AI, what do you do with that? Now you proliferate it. Somebody else is using that information, and suddenly you've completely lost the truth. And you can't actually move your company forward if you don't have that truth to anchor back to. So I'm a big believer in organizing the company around truth and knowledge, and how do we reuse that truth and knowledge and grow that truth and knowledge. You can use the autonomous agents to extend that truth and knowledge, but you have to have some people involved that say this is right, this is the truth that we all agree to, and some of it is hard and fast laws like Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Like we have to follow SOX compliance, right? So but I'm concerned with in individual pockets and isolated applications. It's very easy to build agents that aren't anchored back to any enterprise truths, but it makes it seem like a really good story. But then when you go to actually apply that to a production decision, it has no teeth and it won't stick.
When you deploy autonomous agents that make customer level decisions, like your pre-built customer lifetime value agent in an agent builder, which you have, how do you govern what that agent can do and can't do on its own?
You don't want to fully autonomize an agent to make a decision that is completely irreversible and can do harm, right? So there's definitely a spectrum of risk that you use when evaluating how fully autonomous do we make this thing, and it should be based on your company's risk appetite for different things, right? So something that is significantly more risky, like doing something, executing a transaction directly with a customer, needs more careful governance and humans in the loop, right? So you need to kind of increase, you have a certain amount of human intervention, human coaching, human guidance that kind of grows as the risk grows. And I think that having that spectrum defined is really important. Really important. But hard rule of thumb right now, and I think this is similar to something outside of a company. Like you wouldn't want an autonomous AI thing. I'm just going to call it a thing that cannot be held accountable, because somebody has to be accountable for something. And if you deploy agents that can do something harmful and irreversible, and then there's no accountability, that's not a good thing. Whereas if I'm implementing, or if I'm sharing something that was generated by AI content, I'm inherently responsible for that, right? But when you deploy things autonomously as a company, now you've got this essentially a robot that is executing things potentially without accountability. That's something we haven't figured out how to even resolve in the real world either. So stay away from that.
Agent Builder, which is your agent, it supports open source framework like LangChain and LangGraph. Generally every cloud provider and startup is launching their own agent framework. Why did you decide to bet on open source rather than building a proprietary walled garden? Is that a philosophical choice?
Yeah, there's definitely a philosophical component to that. Interoperability, I think, it's important, more important than ever. We don't want to, I think extensibility is more important than trying to, listen, we also need to recognize that, and I made this point earlier, Teradata will never exist in isolation. So the chances of a company not having something else, especially if they're leveraging LangChain in Bedrock or something else, we need to be able to accommodate that. We don't want to restrict our customers' ability to create agents on top of their Teradata knowledge, just because we decided to build something specific to Teradata, right? The agent builder it's important in that it's a bridge to the knowledge, and it's a way to deploy applications and consume information, but we don't want that to be the only way, right? Whatever we can do to make data and knowledge more readily available and consumable to agents, we should do. So I think it's also a crowded market, right, Sanjay? I mean, I think everybody's trying to build their own workflow capabilities. So yes, we have an agent builder that makes it natively possible to build and deploy agents with Teradata, but the technology that you use to do that is flexible, right? As long as you're
Okay.
connecting it to Teradata.
Okay, that's fair. You brought up a topic of hallucinations, and this is another question that came up for you. Was your CEO, Mike Hutchinson, acknowledged publicly about hallucinations? As the chief data AI officer, how do you architect safeguards against hallucinations when your agents are accessing generally 4 decades of mission critical enterprise data? And how do you do that, Josh? That's a question for you.
The layers of knowledge are very important, and within those knowledge layers, having an agreed upon structure that can be consumed and force feeding information that the LLMs need to anchor back to, all of those are really important. So, starting with some fundamental use cases, you have to understand, especially if you're building a business case, this business case is predicated on getting these types of answers out of this AI solution. Those types of answers have to have a perspective and a point of view from a company knowledge standpoint, and those things need to be force fed. I'm saying force fed. That's not a technological term, but force fed into the overall model to ensure that we're separating what the LLMs can infer on their own from the things that are non-discretionary, right? The company's ARR is non-discretionary. I don't want my LLM deciding what it is. But I may have a separate use case where I say, create a forecast of potential scenarios for ARR, but it's still based on historical accurate data and a number of other dimensions. And then we're saying, okay, I actually do want your opinion, Claude, on this particular thing, right? But one of the hardest things that we have to do, and we all need to do, is educate our workforce on understanding the difference, right? And the difference is going to be in the outputs, and the outputs are text, conversational. So, depending on what the output is for a specific AI solution, it may be very hard to discern what did the LLM decide on its own, or what is it suggesting is a possibility versus what is a hard truth. And you have to architect that from the ground up, but you also have to build into the outputs constant feedback loops and ensure that you have humans in the loop before you actually deploy anything that's fully autonomous, right? Because you've got to make sure that people do understand the difference, and you can vet out hallucinating scenarios, but also the new models, right? You have to test the new models, and that's going to be a challenge. I'm an advocate for standardizing, and I know LLMs have been commoditized essentially, right? We don't build our own LLMs at Teradata, even though we could. It wouldn't be smart to do so. That innovation is happening so fast. Pick a couple LLM partners that you want to consume and utilize and go through iterations on, so you can actually get things out to market quicker, or you can actually implement things within your company quicker.
You said just pick a couple and stick with it, but what if some other model comes in that is, as you said, Opus 4.6? That's a major shift that has happened here. How do your peers kind of decide which models to go? Or
So our product engineering organization necessarily has to validate almost every model, right? That comes out there because the platform is model agnostic for those LLMs, right? So there's a list of, so part of my job in partnership with IT is to enable a safe space to test all of those models out with our product. We separate that from our corporate use cases, right? Corporate use cases, the things that move the company forward, and we standardize within the corporation on a couple of LLMs. So my recommendation, and what I'm saying with my prior answer, is that companies that consume, so a customer of Teradata should pick, they'll have their LLMs, and they may be totally different than Teradata's, but don't try to do everything. Don't try to use every LLM. So we actually do, it's a very hard problem to solve in Teradata. We have to create two different paths, one for engineering to test interoperability with everything, and then one for corporate where, because I'm not going to expose our company's most valuable assets to all of these different versions of LLMs for everything that comes out. So that's a distinction.
talking about technology, workforce, people, we touched a little bit about on that. Just a couple of questions on that. You have seen, we've talked about Opus 4.6, and we've seen what's happened with Claude. It's an incredible tool. There are several IDs like Windsurf, Replit, many others that are just doing incredible stuff. How do you see, you talked about the architect, you learned about architecture, enterprise architecture. So one question would be, is AI changing the practice of enterprise architecture? Are we heading towards a world where the architect's job is to design for AI rather than design with humans in mind? That's one question for you.
Yeah, I think the data foundation is still super important. And I'm not just saying that because Teradata is a data and AI company, right? I think that the company data foundation is still super important. And all of the other architectural components need to build off of that. But of course, there's still, the people, process, technology, data, the standard architectural components that come into play. Some fundamentals haven't changed. Like, you still need to look at your business processes when you're implementing solutions. Your question about enterprise architecture in general, I think we need to redefine what enterprise architecture means. One of the interesting things I think has happened over the last couple of years, especially, is that there was, especially in 2025, I think, AI initiatives were coming in a separate pipeline from the rest of the company initiatives. We need to realign those things, because at the end of the day, they're business transformation initiatives, they're business drivers. We need to realign the technology with the AI, and make those decisions in kind of a joint mode. And I think enterprise architecture has been redefined. We're probably not, we probably haven't fully structured the future enterprise architecture principles to account for the dynamic nature of AI yet. But I think we need to. And you could still rely on some of those foundational principles to make sure that you don't architect yourselves into a hole. But the biggest thing to combat right now, and here's a parallel. I could probably draw a parallel to when SaaS solutions first came out, Sanjay, right? So when SaaS solutions first became a thing, we had tool sprawl, we had tech sprawl, we had data sprawl, data drift, data sprawl, because it was easier to spin up applications outside of like a governed technology stack. We're seeing the same thing with AI. I can build an app on top of another thing that all of a sudden I've built this shadow IT thing that's running completely independently. We have to build new governance and architecture principles around all of that. My team is working very hard to figure that out. We want people to innovate. We want people to move quickly, but not if the information's bad, not if the decisions are bad, right? So that's the balance that we need to get back to.
The chief AI officer's role is kind of getting defined every day. Arnold Schwarzenegger used to say, work on your strongest muscle. Which muscle should they be working on?
I still think understanding the nexus of technology and business decision making is the key to being successful. And I know that's a simplified perspective. I think it's a great place to be right now, but you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Something I don't think we talk enough about, Sanjay, is that so much information right now is being generated at a rate that is impossible for humans to consume, which means we have knowledge being generated way faster than we're able to consume it. Even if you have a conversation with Claude or Copilot, it's able to produce way more information in a 1 hour window than you could possibly comprehend in your brain. We need to figure out, what are we going to do with all of that generated knowledge? How are we putting that back into the context of your company? How are we putting that back into a usable state across the world? And how can we adapt to the fact that we're never going to be as smart as or as knowledgeable as these models are? It's a very strange feeling, because your knowledge workers, now we're encouraging our knowledge workers to offload some of their knowledge to make the models smarter so that they can move on to something more creative or different, right? But that's, so anybody who's looking to be a chief data and AI officer, two things are absolutely true. Product development is changing so rapidly, it's hard to even comprehend right now. And I'm not being alarmist. That is a fact. And also, knowledge is coming at us at a pace that is impossible for us to consume. So think about those two things and how you would accommodate for those two shifts if you're moving into that role.
Josh, finally, we have a lightning round of questions where we try to, I wouldn't say put you on the hot seat, but maybe a little bit try to get you one-word answers from you. You ready?
All right, let's do it.
Okay. Cloud only or hybrid AI deployment?
Hybrid.
Open source or proprietary LLMs?
Open source.
Structured or unstructured data for AI?
It has to be both.
Single agent or multi-agent architectures?
Multi-agent.
Okay. Biggest AI risk, hallucinations or bias?
Hallucinations.
Okay. Finally, this should be an easy one for you. The CDAO role in 5 years, do you think it becomes an essential or it's an obsolete?
Essential.
Josh, this has been an amazing conversation. I could have gone on for hours. I had so much more, but we'll have to get you back again. Thank you, Josh. It was fantastic.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the Chief AI Officer podcast with Sanjay Puri. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you thought. And share it with someone curious about the future of AI. Join us every Friday right here on the CAIO podcast as we share more stories and insights from the leaders shaping what's ahead.